pressed into clay tablets discovered across 3 continents. Sumerian texts describe rituals where blood was not merely spilled, but purposefully directed, where the substance of life itself was understood as the primary currency between humans and the divine. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest complete narratives in human history, states explicitly that humanity was fashioned from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. The text is clinical in its specificity, describing the mixture, the purpose, and the theological consequence that would bind humanity to the Anunnaki through blood obligation for all time. That consequence never formally ended. Welcome. I'm genuinely glad you're here tonight, however late the hour finds you, ready to explore one of ancient history's most compelling and sobering mysteries. Thank you for choosing to spend this time examining what Sumerian cuneiform texts actually preserve about sacred blood ritual and its relationship to the Anunnaki. Scholars have studied these texts for over 150 years, and the debate about what they describe remains surprisingly alive. Mainstream scholarship reads the blood ritual narratives as sophisticated theological literature, ancient peoples processing universal truths about life, death, sacrifice, and divine obligation through ceremonial practice that serve deep psychological and social functions. The rituals maintained community cohesion, structured sacred time, provided mechanisms for addressing divine debt, and encoded cosmological understanding in embodied practice. But alternative researchers examining the same tablets ask different questions. Why such operational specificity in texts that are supposedly purely symbolic? Why do independent civilizations across the ancient world develop nearly identical blood ritual frameworks if these practices emerged from local imagination alone? And why do certain Sumerian texts describe blood offerings in language that sounds less like poetry and more like procedure, less like myth and more like record? We are not here tonight to settle that debate. Honest scholarship hasn't settled it, and we won't either in a single evening. What we are here to do is explore the actual evidence, the tablets, the temple archaeology, the ritual calendars, the documented ceremonies, and to sit with the genuine wonder of what these ancient practices reveal about how our earliest civilizations understood the relationship between human blood and divine presence. These questions are among the oldest humans have asked. They reach back before writing, before cities, before the first priest pressed the first reed into wet clay. They reach into something fundamental about what it means to be alive, to be mortal, to carry within your veins a substance that ancient peoples across every continent recognized as sacred. Take a breath now, a slow one. Let your body settle wherever you are. Maybe you're in bed, the room dark around you. Maybe you're in a chair with the house gone quiet. Whatever the hour, whatever the space, you're exactly where you need to be for this kind of exploration. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest. We have time. If this kind of deep historical exploration brings you something valuable tonight, perhaps you'd consider leaving a like or subscribing. It helps others find their way to these questions. These ancient voices still speaking across 4,000 years of silence. Thank you. Now then, let's begin not with the rituals themselves, but with the world that made them necessary. Close your eyes if you'd like. Picture a landscape without cities, without temples, without writing or law or the concept of sacred architecture. Picture the Mesopotamian plain before Sumer existed, before the Tigris and Euphrates had been tamed by human engineering, when the land between the rivers was raw and unordered, and the night sky blazed with stars that no priest had yet assigned to any god. In that world, blood already meant something. It meant life departing. It meant the moment between living and not living, that threshold crossing that every human and animal must eventually make. Long before anyone built an altar, long before the first cuneiform mark was pressed into clay, people had noticed that blood and life were the same thing. That one ended when the other did. That observation would eventually become theology. That theology would become ritual. And those rituals would be pressed into tablets that we can still read tonight, their wedge-shaped marks still carrying the weight of what ancient priests believed they were doing when they approached the altar, when the ceremony began, when the blood fell and the gods were believed to draw near. Let us go back to the beginning of that world, to the landscape and the climate, and the slow human awakening that eventually produced the most elaborate ritual civilization the ancient Near East would ever know. 12,000 years before the first Sumerian priest approached the first altar, the land that would become Mesopotamia was something entirely different. Not a cradle of civilization, but a raw, wind-scoured plain where the Tigris and Euphrates ran shallow and braided, where reed marshes spread for kilometers in every direction, where the air smelled of river silt and wild grasses baking under a sun that rose and set with no human ceremony to mark its passing. The land was alive, relentlessly alive, but it was alive on its own terms. Nothing yet had been organized, consecrated, or assigned to any god. The Ice Age was ending its long retreat. Glaciers covering the northern mountain ranges released meltwater in spring floods that reshaped riverbeds annually, depositing fresh layers of extraordinarily fertile silt across the southern plain. This geological generosity would later make Mesopotamia the agricultural engine of the ancient world, capable of supporting population densities that still astonish archaeologists. But in these early millennia, around 10,000 BCE, that fertility was simply wilderness, ungoverned abundance that fed gazelle and wild boar and the scattered bands of hunters who moved through the landscape following seasonal migrations. The sea level sat roughly 120 meters lower than it does today. The Persian Gulf extended far less distance inland than its current shoreline suggests. What would later become the southernmost reaches of Mesopotamian civilization, the cities of Eridu and Ur, stood well inland from the coast during the Ice Age, but would eventually sit much closer to the water as glaciers continued melting and seas continued rising over the following millennia. The landscape was literally still forming, the stage being constructed even as the first actors were learning their roles. Long before blood ritual existed, blood itself was already everywhere in this landscape. Hunters encountered it daily. Every successful kill meant the smell of iron in cold morning air, the warmth leaving an animal's body as life became meat. These early peoples understood something visceral that later theological systems would formalize. Blood marked the boundary between alive and dead. It was the most immediate evidence of the life force departing. You could watch it happen. The animal bled, and then the animal was no longer an animal but something else entirely, something that could be eaten, something that could sustain more life. This observation, so simple and so primal, would take approximately 8,000 years to become the elaborate ritual theology of Sumer. But the seed was here, in these pre-agricultural hunters who processed every kill with attention that was practical and perhaps also something more, who may have performed gestures of acknowledgement over fallen animals that archaeology cannot recover because they left no physical trace. The stars overhead in this period were the same stars visible tonight, though precession has shifted their position slightly in the sky across 12 millennia. Orion rose and set over the empty plain where Uruk would one day house 40,000 people. Venus traced its 584-day cycle between morning and evening appearances, with no priest to record the observation. The night sky was brilliant without any competing light from human settlement. The Milky Way, a luminous river from horizon to horizon, stars so numerous and clear that modern people living in cities have genuinely never seen their equivalent. Watching that sky over seasons and years, early peoples noticed patterns. Animals behaved differently at certain moon phases. Floods came at predictable stellar alignments. The boundary between night and day, like the boundary between living and dead, was marked by transition, by threshold crossing that seemed to matter, that seemed to require acknowledgement. Perhaps this is where the impulse toward ritual truly begins, not in theology, but in pattern recognition, in the human mind's relentless search for order within change. By around 9,500 BCE, something remarkable was happening in southeastern Turkey at a site we now call Göbekli Tepe. Hunter-gatherers, people who still had no agriculture and no permanent settlements, were quarrying limestone pillars weighing up to 16 metric tons and arranging them in precise circles. The pillars are carved with animals: foxes, scorpions, vultures, serpents, and wild boar. Archaeologists excavating the site since 1994 under Klaus Schmidt found no evidence of permanent habitation, suggesting Göbekli Tepe was a ceremonial center that people traveled to, not a place where anyone lived. Animal bone assemblages at Göbekli Tepe tell a specific story. Gazelle, aurochs, and wild boar were slaughtered there in enormous quantities, their bones deposited in deliberate concentrations. This was not casual hunting, but organized feasting. Communal consumption of meat on a scale that required coordination and planning. The blood of these animals fell on ground that people had invested enormous labor in shaping. Whether this constitutes ritual sacrifice in the theological sense that Sumerian priests would later formalize remains debated, but the evidence strongly suggests intentional, ceremonial killing connected to shared meaning that extended beyond simple hunger. The impulse toward consecrated space, toward purposeful blood, toward marking certain moments as different from ordinary time, predates Sumerian civilization by thousands of years. By the time the first cuneiform marks were pressed into clay at Uruk around 3400 BCE, humanity had been developing ritual consciousness for longer than civilization had yet existed. Sumer did not invent sacred blood practice. It inherited a tradition already ancient beyond memory and gave it architecture, theology, calendar, and written record. What that record reveals begins not with the rituals themselves, but with the theology that made them necessary, the belief system that transformed blood from biological substance into cosmic currency, from life fluid into divine language that gods were understood to hear, to need, and to answer. The transformation of blood from biological fact into theological substance did not happen in a single moment or a single culture. It emerged gradually across thousands of years of human experience, shaped by observation, by loss, by the universal encounter with mortality that every human consciousness must eventually navigate. But certain developments in the ancient Near East mark identifiable steps in this transformation, moments when evidence in stone and bone and eventually clay suggests that blood had crossed a threshold from practical reality into sacred meaning. Scattered across the Zagros Mountains that form the northeastern border of Mesopotamia, archaeological sites dating between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE reveal the earliest evidence of what scholars cautiously call ritual animal treatment. At sites like Zawi Chemi Shanidar in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, excavated by Ralph Solecki in the 1950s and 60s, researchers found deposits of large raptor wings and wild sheep skulls arranged in patterns inconsistent with simple food processing. The bones were positioned deliberately, the arrangement suggesting ceremony rather than consumption. Something was being done with animal remains that went beyond eating. The Atemu concept, which would later become central to Sumerian theological understanding of blood, has roots in beliefs that predate writing by millennia. The Atemu was understood as the spirit substance that animated living beings, the force that departed when life ended. Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE describe the Atemu leaving the body at death, requiring proper ritual treatment of the corpse to ensure peaceful transition. But the concept's sophistication suggests long development through oral tradition, accumulated thinking about the nature of life and what carries it. Blood was the visible carrier of the Atemu. When an animal or person bled, the Atemu was understood to be departing with the blood, flowing outward from the body into a space between living and dead. This made blood uniquely powerful as ritual substance. It was not merely symbolic of life force, but was understood as actually containing it, as being the physical medium through which divine essence moved. Pouring blood intentionally in consecrated space, directed toward divine recipients, was not symbolic gesture, but practical action with real theological consequences. Long before Sumerian temples existed, the transition from hunting to agriculture created a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with blood. When animals were wild and hunted, their deaths were pursued but uncertain, outcomes of chase and skill and chance. when animals were domesticated, penned, fed by human hands for months or years before slaughter, their deaths became entirely deliberate. The farmer who raised a sheep from birth and then cut its throat possessed a different relationship to that death than a hunter who killed a wild animal in the field. This deliberateness transformed the moral and psychological weight of killing. Agricultural peoples developed practices around animal death that hunters had not needed. Apologies offered to the animal, ritual gestures that acknowledged the taking of life, ceremonies that framed slaughter as meaningful rather than merely necessary. These practices varied across cultures but share a common underlying logic: the recognition that deliberately ending a life that you have sustained requires acknowledgement, requires some form of accounting between the killer and what was killed. By around 6000 BCE, the southern Mesopotamian plain was seeing early agricultural settlements. The site of Eridu, which Sumerian tradition identifies as the first city and the original home of Enki, shows continuous occupation from approximately 5400 BCE, with temple structures appearing in the earliest occupation layers. Beneath the mud brick floors of these proto-temples, archaeologists found deposits of fish bones, the primary food of the region, placed in what appeared to be intentional offering deposits rather than ordinary refuse. Eridu's earliest inhabitants were already setting aside specific substances in specific spaces with apparent intentionality. The shift from food offering to blood offering represents an intensification of this same logic. If the gods required feeding, as Sumerian theology would explicitly state, then what better offering than the substance that carried the most potent life force? Fish bones were good, grain was valuable, but blood from a living animal, warm and immediate, the atemu still present in it, offered something that processed food could not: direct access to the animating force that the gods themselves possessed and that made life possible. Imagine standing in one of those early Eridu shrines. A small, single room, perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters, the walls of mud brick still bearing traces of white plaster. The floor is packed earth, slightly damp from the high water table. An altar stone sits at the western end, simple and flat, perhaps 60 centimeters across. The air smells of river mud and something else, something that iron carries, faint but present. Fish bones are arranged carefully in a deposit near the wall. Whatever ceremony placed them there is finished now. The room is still. What did the people who built this room believe about what happened when offerings were made? The texts that would eventually answer that question were still 2,000 years in the future, but the architecture already tells us something. They set aside this space, they made it different from ordinary space. They brought things here and placed them with intention. The boundary between sacred and ordinary was already being drawn, the lines that would eventually frame the most elaborate ritual system in the ancient world. The Sumerian theological framework that would fully articulate blood rituals' mechanics was building itself slowly through accumulated practice and oral transmission, through generations of observation about what seemed to work, what seemed to please divine forces, what seemed to maintain the order that agriculture and settled life required. By the time writing emerged to capture these beliefs in permanent form, they were already ancient, already refined through millennia of practice. The beliefs that writing would eventually preserve describe a cosmos in which blood was not incidental to divine relationship, but foundational to it, in which the Anunnaki themselves had shed divine blood to create humanity, and in which humanity therefore existed in permanent ritual obligation that only blood could properly address. Understanding that obligation requires understanding how the temples were built to receive it. Approaching the Great Temple at Nippur around 2100 BCE, the Akur dedicated to Enlil, you would first notice it from a distance of several kilometers. The ziggurat rose approximately 30 meters above the flat plain, its stepped profile visible across the entire agricultural district that fed and served it. The structure was not beautiful in any delicate sense. It was massive, deliberate, its mud brick surfaces baked to the color of dried earth, its scale communicating something about proportion between human and divine that required no written explanation. Closer in, approaching through the city itself, you would pass through zones of increasing sanctity. The outer city was commerce and residence, crowded and loud with the noise of civilization operating at full density. An inner wall separated the sacred precinct from the secular city. Inside that wall, the atmosphere changed in ways that were partly architectural and partly sensory. The crowds thinned, the air carried different smells. Cedar oil burned in temple lamps, incense from imported resins, and beneath those refined scents, something older and more basic that the ceremonies produced. The temple was not designed for congregational worship in the way modern religious buildings are. Ordinary people did not enter the inner sanctum. The god dwelled there in physical form, represented by a statue of precious materials that priests tended as one tends a living dignitary, washing it, dressing it, feeding it, and conducting ceremonies in its presence that were understood to maintain the cosmic order. The temple served as both divine residence and operational facility, the place where the relationship between Anunnaki and humanity was actively managed through ritual practice, including blood offering. Archaeological excavations at Nippur, conducted by University of Pennsylvania expeditions between 1889 and 1900 and resumed by Oriental Institute teams from 1948 onward, revealed physical evidence of this ritual architecture in extraordinary detail. Temple floors sloped slightly towards central drainage channels cut into the paving stones, channels angled precisely to direct liquid offerings away from the altar space and toward collection points. These were not accidental features, but engineered design, built into the temple's foundation plan before the first course of mud brick was laid above them. The drainage channels at Nippur measured between 8 and 15 centimeters wide, cut into limestone pavers that formed the altar platform's surface. Similar drainage systems appear at Uruk's Iana precinct, at Ur's sacred precinct beneath the ziggurat of Nana, and at Tel Ubaid, one of the earliest cult sites in southern Mesopotamia, dating to approximately 5000 BCE. The consistency of this architectural feature across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years suggests a shared understanding of what temples needed to be capable of managing. Blood requires drainage. Grain offerings do not. Incense burns and disperses. Libations of beer and water can be absorbed into earth floors without pooling, but substantial blood sacrifice from large animals, the kind of offering that temple texts document in specific quantities and frequencies, requires infrastructure. The drainage systems built into Sumerian temple floors were not metaphorical features. They were practical engineering in service of a theology that required the regular shedding of animal blood in consecrated space. The altar itself served as both sacred and functional surface. At Leonard Woolley's excavations between 1922 and 1934 uncovered altar platforms constructed from burnt brick, fired harder than standard mud brick construction, better able to withstand repeated washing. The surface area of primary altars at major temple sites typically ranged between 1.5 and 3 square meters, large enough to accommodate animals up to the size of adult bulls. Copper rings embedded in altar platforms at several sites allowed restraint of animals during ceremony, a practical detail that confirms these were working ritual spaces rather than symbolic installations. The ziggurat itself functioned as vertical axis connecting earth to heaven, its stages representing the levels of the cosmos as Sumerian theology understood them. The ground level connected to the earthly realm and the Abzu beneath. Each successive stage ascended toward the divine realm of the sky gods. The summit temple, the god's actual dwelling, sat at the apex of this cosmic diagram made architectural. When blood was shed at ground level and at summit level, it connected both ends of the cosmic axis simultaneously, serving as both a earthly offering and a celestial one. Temple hymns, a genre of Sumerian religious literature preserved across dozens of tablets, describe specific temples using language that emphasizes their function as containers and processors of sacred substance. The Ekur at Nippur is called a place whose inside is filled with pure light, and the house where fates are decreed. The Iana at Uruk is described as the house of the evening star, Inanna's celestial form. These descriptions served as both prayer and architectural specification, telling us that these buildings were understood as functioning cosmic machinery, not merely impressive architecture. The priesthood that managed this machinery was itself structured in hierarchical layers reflecting the divine hierarchy the temples served. High priests, called En or Entu depending on the specific role and deity, underwent extensive training and ritual purification before performing blood ceremonies. Subordinate priests maintained daily temple operations, fed the god's statue, cleaned ritual implements, and managed the economic redistribution of sacrificed animals' meat to temple workers and dependents. The temple was simultaneously theological center, economic hub, and ritual processing facility. Taking a breath here, letting that picture settle. The temple was not merely a building, but a system, an integrated structure for managing the relationship between human and divine through regular, scheduled, carefully prescribed ritual action. Blood moved through these spaces, not as aberration, but as expected, managed substance, the physical medium through which divine obligation was discharged and cosmic order was maintained. What that maintenance required, on a day-to-day and month-to-month basis, becomes visible in the texts we turn to next, the tablets that describe the rituals themselves in the specific, sometimes startling language of priests who believed they were recording not mythology, but operating procedure. Tablet CBS 13532, held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection, preserves 87 lines of Sumerian text describing the preparation and conduct of a blood offering to Enlil at Nippur. The tablet dates to approximately 1700 BCE, though the ritual it describes is certainly older, preserved through generations of oral transmission before a scribe pressed it into permanent form. The clay is pale brown, roughly 14 centimeters by 11 centimeters, its surface covered in neat columns of wedge-shaped impressions that describe not theology, but procedure. Which animals, which priest, which time of month, which prayers spoken at which moment in the sequence. This is what makes Sumerian ritual texts different from mythology. They are operational documents. The Atrahasis epic, dated in its standard Babylonian version to approximately 1700 BCE, but preserving Sumerian material at least 5 centuries older, contains the foundational blood ritual narrative of the entire tradition. The relevant passage is direct. The god We-Ela was slaughtered in assembly, his blood collected and mixed with clay by the mother goddess Nintu to create the first humans. The Akkadian text uses the word tabihu for the slaughter, a term that appears consistently in sacrificial contexts throughout Mesopotamian literature, the same word used for temple animal slaughter in administrative records documenting daily temple operations. This word choice was not accidental. The scribes who composed and copied the Atrahasis epic understood We-Ela's death as sacrifice, as the same category of ritual action performed in temples daily. By using sacrificial vocabulary for the original divine death that created humanity, they established a direct theological connection between temple blood ritual and human origins. Every subsequent sacrifice was not merely an offering, but a reenactment, a remembering in the most literal sense of the cosmic event that made human existence possible. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic composed around 2100 BCE, preserves a parallel tradition. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and organizes the cosmos from her body, he creates humanity from the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's war leader. The Akkadian text specifies that Kingu's blood was mixed with bone to create human beings, with the explicit purpose of service to the gods. Two independent creation traditions, separated by centuries and regional theological differences, agree on the essential point. Human beings were made from divine blood, and that origin carries permanent consequence. Temple hymns from the Ur III period, approximately 2100 to 2000 BCE, describe blood offerings in language that is simultaneously poetic and specific. A hymn to Nana, the moon god, preserved on a tablet from Nippur, describes the god's pleasure at receiving blood offerings. The pure blood of the slaughtered ox rises to you, the blood that is like the lapis lazuli of the sky. The comparison to lapis lazuli is significant, not merely decorative. Lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan at enormous expense, was among the most precious materials in the Mesopotamian world, associated with divine presence and the night sky's deep blue. Comparing blood to lapis lazuli elevated it from biological substance to cosmic material of the highest value. The Me tablets, fragmentary texts describing the divine powers or cosmic principles that Enki possessed and that Inanna famously stole, include blood ritual among the fundamental organizing principles of civilization. The Me of the descent to the underworld and the ascent from the underworld appear alongside the Me of kingship, priesthood, and the scribal art as equivalent foundations of proper cosmic order. This placement reveals how Sumerian theology categorized blood ritual, not as peripheral practice, but as structurally essential, as fundamental to maintaining the world's proper functioning as governance or literacy. Archaeological evidence confirms that these texts described actual practice rather than purely theoretical theology. At Ur's sacred precinct, excavations led by Leonard Woolley uncovered what he identified as a great death pit in the royal cemetery, dating to approximately 2600 BCE. Among the 74 bodies discovered in one pit were copper bowls, some still containing residue of organic material, positioned near individuals who appeared to have died in organized ceremony. Woolley's interpretation of ritual killing at the burial site remains debated, but the physical evidence of organized ceremonial death on a significant scale is difficult to explain through other frameworks. Bone assemblages from temple sites across Mesopotamia provide quantitative evidence of sacrifice scale. At the Inanna Temple at Nippur, zooarchaeological analysis of excavated deposits identified remains of sheep, goats, cattle, and doves in concentrations and conditions consistent with ritual slaughter rather than ordinary food processing. The bones showed specific butchering patterns. Particular animals were disarticulated in ways that matched the procedures described in sacrificial procedure texts, with certain cuts preserved and others discarded in patterns that only make sense within a ritual rather than culinary framework. Dating these ritual practices requires triangulating multiple lines of evidence. The texts provide relative chronology, older Sumerian compositions underlying later Babylonian adaptations. Stratigraphy at excavated temple sites places physical evidence within architectural sequences. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from temple deposits provides absolute dates. Together, these methods establish that blood ritual was not a late development in Sumerian religion, but present from the earliest layers of temple construction, built into the architecture and theology simultaneously. The unanswered questions are significant. We do not know with certainty how often major blood sacrifices occurred at specific temples. Temple administrative texts document some sacrifices, but likely not all, especially those associated with restricted ceremonies, not meant for general record. We do not know the full content of the oral traditions that accompanied sacrifice, the prayers and incantations that made the blood theologically effective, and we do not know whether the accounts of divine blood in creation myths were understood as literal cosmic history or as metaphorical framework for practices whose true origins were simply lost to time. What we do know is that these texts were carefully preserved, repeatedly copied, and taught to generations of scribal students alongside practical subjects like mathematics and commercial law. Their preservation suggests they were considered essential knowledge, records of something foundational that each generation needed to inherit and understand. We turn now to the most foundational of these narratives, the story of Waila's sacrifice and what it established for all time. The Atrahasis epic describes a moment before humanity existed when the divine assembly faced a labor crisis with no obvious solution. The Agigi, the lesser gods who maintained creation's physical infrastructure, had been digging the great rivers and irrigation canals for 40 years. Their rebellion was not violent so much as exhausted. They burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's temple, demanding relief. The assembly convened. Enki proposed creating substitute workers from clay, But clay alone was insufficient. Clay without the animating divine substance would produce nothing more than mud. Something divine had to be added. Someone had to give it. The god chosen for sacrifice was We'ila, described in the Akkadian text as Ilu Temenim, a phrase scholars translate as the god who has rationality or the god who has understanding. The specific attribute selected for sacrifice is significant. Among all possible divine qualities, rationality was what humanity would need most to perform complex labor, to follow instructions, to organize effort according to external direction rather than instinct. By sacrificing specifically the god who possessed this quality, the creation myth explains not just how humans were made, but why humans can think, plan, and understand. We inherited rationality from the divine being whose death created us. In the spring of 1965, British Museum cuneiformist W.G. Lambert was working in the museum's tablet storage room in London, examining a collection of fragmentary tablets from Nippur that had arrived in the museum's collection decades earlier, but remained incompletely studied. The room was cool and dry, the tablets laid out on padded trays under controlled lighting, each piece catalogued but not yet fully understood. Lambert was systematically examining fragments of what appeared to be a ritual text when he noticed that two separately catalogued pieces had broken edges that matched precisely. The fracture patterns aligned, the cuneiform columns continued across the break, and when he held them together under his magnifying glass, a previously missing section of the We'ila sacrifice narrative became visible for the first time since the tablet had broken in antiquity. The reunited text described the actual procedure of the sacrifice in detail not preserved in any other known source. The assembly of gods present, the specific invocation spoken, and a phrase describing the blood being collected into a vessel before being mixed with clay, a procedural detail suggesting the ceremony had specific technical requirements rather than being a simple slaughter. Lambert published his findings in 1965 in the journal Iraq, and the scholarly community recognized immediately that this fragment filled a critical gap in understanding the relationship between the mythological creation narrative and actual temple blood ritual. The procedural language in the newly joined text matched the language used in contemporary sacrificial procedure texts, confirming what scholars had long suspected. The creation myth and the temple ritual describe the same category of action, understood by their practitioners as continuous with each other across cosmic and historical time. The theological implications of We'ila's sacrifice extend far beyond the moment of creation. By establishing that the first humans were made from divine blood, the Atrahasis epic created a permanent framework of obligation that structured all subsequent human-divine relationship. Humans were not merely servants of the gods. We were, in a biological and theological sense, made of the gods. The Atemu that animated us, the rational soul that made us capable of complex thought and language and worship, came directly from a divine being who died specifically to provide it. This created what Sumerian theology treated as unpayable debt. Not moral debt in the abstract sense, but something closer to familial obligation, the recognition that you owe your existence to someone whose sacrifice made you possible. The rituals that Sumerian temples conducted, the blood offerings that priests performed on precise calendrical schedules, were understood as partial payment against a debt that could be serviced but never fully discharged. Every sacrifice reenacted We'ila's original death, not symbolically, but in the theological understanding of Sumerian priests, as actual repetition of the cosmic event that established the terms of human existence. The mother goddess Nintu's role in the creation deserves attention. She was the divine craftsperson who actually mixed We'ila's blood with clay, who shaped the first humans, who recited the incantations that activated the divine substance within the earthly material. Her title, Belet Ili, Lady of the Gods, appears in ritual contexts connected to human birth throughout Mesopotamian history, suggesting that the creation mythology was directly connected to actual birth ritual practice. The same divine figure who created humanity in mythological time was invoked at individual human births, the cosmic and the personal connected through ceremonial continuity. The 14 first humans, 7 male and 7 female, created from Wi'ila's blood and earth, began the labor the Igigi had abandoned. The texts say they worked. The divine infrastructure was maintained. The crisis passed. But the blood that made them continued circulating through generations, carrying in every human body a trace of the divine sacrifice that had made consciousness possible. That trace is what temple ritual addressed, what blood offerings acknowledged, what the entire theological architecture of Sumerian sacred practice was designed to honor and maintain. The first divine blood established a pattern that every subsequent altar would attempt to reflect. Carved into a limestone stele discovered at Nippur in 1899 and now held in the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, a text known as the Nippur Calendar preserves the sacrificial schedule for Enlil's temple across a single year. The document is administrative rather than devotional, a working schedule for priests and temple managers specifying which animals were required on which dates, which ceremonies demanded which categories of offering, and which priests held responsibility for each ritual sequence. It reads less like scripture and more like an operations manual for a complex organization with multiple overlapping commitments and limited resources. The scale is striking. In a single month, the temple of Enlil at Nippur was expected to receive dozens of sheep, multiple cattle, quantities of birds specified by species, and in certain months, animals of specific color or age that texts describe as possessing particular ritual efficacy. The total annual sacrifice at a major temple like Nippur's Ikur likely numbered in the thousands of individual animals, a logistical and economic undertaking that required the agricultural productivity of substantial surrounding territory to sustain. The lunar cycle structured the entire sacrificial calendar. New moon and full moon were primary ritual occasions at every major Sumerian temple, moments when the boundary between human and divine realms was considered most permeable, when offerings were most likely to reach their divine recipients effectively. The new moon ceremony for Nana, the moon god whose cult center was at required specific blood offerings timed to coincide with the moon's first visible crescent in the western sky after sunset. Priests positioned on the ziggurat's upper stages watched for that crescent, and its appearance triggered the ceremony's beginning. The new moon ritual at reconstructed from multiple fragmentary texts by Assyriologist Mark Cohen in his 1993 study of Mesopotamian cultic calendars, involved a sequence of animal sacrifices beginning at dusk and continuing through the night. First, a lamb was sacrificed. Its blood poured at the base of Nana's altar as what texts call a foundation offering. Then a bull, whose blood was collected and used to anoint the altar's surface in specific patterns described in the ritual texts, but not fully preserved. Then birds, whose small bodies were burned completely rather than partially consumed, described as ascending offerings because the smoke rose toward the divine realm. Long before dawn, the ceremony reached its culmination when the chief priest, having maintained ritual purity through abstention and bathing for 3 days prior, approached the altar's innermost point and performed what texts call the silent rite, a ceremony whose specific content was apparently too restricted for written documentation. The texts describe its existence and its timing, but not its content. What happened in those final hours of the new moon ceremony, in the inner sanctum with only the highest priest present, remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions in Mesopotamian religious scholarship. Seasonal festivals amplified the monthly calendar with ceremonies of greater scale and duration. The Akitu festival, celebrated at the new year in the month of Nisan corresponding roughly to March or April, involved not merely sacrifice, but a multi-day ceremonial sequence that included ritual drama, divine procession, and what appear to have been particularly significant blood offerings connected to the renewal of cosmic order for the coming year. Texts from multiple sites describe the Akitu as a moment when the Anunnaki themselves were believed to be most actively present, when the boundary between divine and human realms thinned to its annual minimum. The animals specified for different gods and different occasions were not interchangeable. Temple procedure texts are explicit. Sheep for Enlil, reflecting the agricultural economy he governed. Bulls for Anu and for ceremonies of maximum cosmic significance, the bull being the most powerful and expensive sacrificial animal. Doves and small birds for Inanna, whose association with the morning star Venus connected her to the brief, delicate appearance of birds at dawn. The specificity suggests a theological understanding in which different divine beings required different substances, different life forces, perhaps because their own natures were understood as fundamentally different. Archaeological evidence at the Temple of Inanna at Nippur confirms the dove association. Excavations there uncovered deposits of small bird bones, primarily Columbidae species corresponding to doves and pigeons, in concentrations near the altar platform that show patterns consistent with ceremonial rather than culinary deposition. The birds had been killed and their blood offered, their small bodies then deposited in specific locations rather than processed as food. This matches the written record precisely, a rare and satisfying alignment between text and physical evidence. Take a breath. We're going deep into ancient practice here, and it's worth pausing to notice how you're receiving this. However you're positioned right now, whatever the darkness around you holds, these ceremonies happened thousands of years ago, in specific buildings we can visit today, recorded on tablets we can read. There's something grounding in that specificity. The unanswered questions in the ritual calendar texts are revealing in themselves. We do not know the full content of restricted ceremonies. We do not know how priests experienced these rituals subjectively, what states of consciousness the ceremonies produced in participants, whether the elaborate sensory environment of blood, incense, chanting, and darkness created experiences that the participants understood as genuine divine contact. And we do not know how ordinary Mesopotamians, who watched public processions and received distributed meat from sacrificial animals but did not enter inner sanctums, understood their relationship to ceremonies conducted in their name. What the calendar reveals beyond doubt is that blood ritual was not occasional or exceptional in Sumerian religious practice. It was regular, scheduled, budgeted for, and built into the economic and administrative structure of civilization at its most fundamental level. The gods required blood on specific days. The calendar told you which days. The temple infrastructure was designed to provide it. This was the system the Anunnaki had established, and that human civilization maintained, month after month, year after year, for 3,000 years. The king who stood at the center of this system bore a particularly complex relationship to the blood rituals that structured sacred time. Understanding that relationship requires understanding what Sumerian theology believed about royal blood itself, and how the king's body became a ritual instrument connecting divine and human realms in ways that ordinary priests could not. In the Sumerian worldview, the king occupied a position that had no precise equivalent in any modern political or religious framework. He was not a god, not quite, but he was not an ordinary human either. Texts from the Ur-3 period, approximately 2112 to 24 BCE, describe kings as nourished with the holy milk of Ninhursag, as called by name by specific Anunnaki before birth, as beings whose blood carried divine quality that ordinary human blood did not possess. This semi-divine status was not merely honorary, it was the theological basis for everything the king was required to do, including his central role in blood ritual. The sacred marriage ceremony, known in Sumerian as the hieros gamos, represents the most intimate expression of royal ritual function. Texts from the reign of Shulgi of Ur, who ruled from approximately 2094 to 2047 BCE, describe the king ritually uniting with Inanna in a ceremony that appears to have combined symbolic and possibly literal elements. The ceremony's purpose was explicitly cosmological. By joining with the goddess, the king renewed the fertility of the land, ensured abundant harvests, and maintained the connection between divine and earthly realms that only royal blood could properly sustain. Temple hymns from Shulgi's reign describe Inanna welcoming him with language that is simultaneously erotic and cosmic. The personal and the universal collapsed into a single ritual act. The Akitu festival at Babylon, which preserved much older Sumerian practice, included a ceremony on its fourth day that reveals the paradoxical nature of royal ritual status. The king was brought before the statue of Marduk, and the high priest removed his royal insignia, his scepter, his ring, his crown. Then the priest struck the king on the cheek, hard enough, the texts specify, to bring tears. The king then knelt and recited a declaration of innocence, affirming that he had not sinned against Babylon, had not neglected the temples, had not struck any subordinate in anger. Marduk's statue was then used to restore the royal insignia, and the king's authority was renewed for another year. This ritual humiliation served multiple theological functions simultaneously. It demonstrated that royal authority derived from divine grant rather than inherent right, that the king's semi-divine blood gave him capacity for the role, but not automatic entitlement to it. The tears drawn by the priest's blow were understood as ritual purification, royal blood momentarily exposed through the broken skin of the cheek, the divine substance within the king briefly made visible before the ceremony restored his intact authority. The blow was not punishment, but theology enacted on the body. Texts from the Neo-Assyrian period, preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and dating to approximately 680 to 627 BCE, describe kings offering their own blood in extreme circumstances. During a particularly threatening eclipse in 671 BCE, texts record that King Esarhaddon made a cut on his arm and allowed blood to fall on the altar of Ashur, the Assyrian national god, as a direct personal offering intended to avert the celestial threat. This was not standard practice, but emergency measure, the king offering his semi-divine blood directly when circumstances demanded the highest possible ritual intensity. The astronomical dimension of royal ritual reveals how thoroughly blood ceremony was integrated with celestial observation. Sumerian and later Babylonian astrologers watched the sky continuously, specifically to identify moments when divine beings were most present and receptive, when the cosmic conditions made ritual action most effective. These astronomical observations were not separate from blood ritual, but directly coordinated with it. Certain planetary configurations required specific sacrifices. Eclipses demanded immediate ceremonial response. Venus's heliacal rising triggered Inanna-associated ceremonies in which blood played a central role. Imagine standing in Ur around 2050 BCE on the night of a new moon ceremony. The ziggurat rises against a sky blazing with stars, its summit temple catching the last light of dusk, while the lower precinct fills with torchlight and the smell of burning cedar oil. The king has been in ritual preparation for 3 days, abstaining from ordinary food, bathing in purified water at prescribed intervals, reciting specific incantations at specific hours. His body has been made as ritually clean as it can be made, prepared to serve as conduit between the divine and human realms that the ceremony requires. The ritual bloodshed that follows serves as the central mechanism of this conduit. Animals die, their atemu carrying blood directed toward divine recipients by priests who have memorized procedures passed down through generations of temple training. The king observes, participates in specific moments, lends his semi-divine presence to the ceremony's efficacy, and when the ceremony ends before dawn, the cosmic order has been maintained for another month. The divine debt partially serviced, the Anunnaki acknowledged as the source of both human existence and royal authority. What remains hidden beneath this public ceremony is what we will explore more fully in later sections: the restricted rites, the inner sanctum ceremonies, the aspects of royal blood ritual that texts mention but never fully describe. Something occurred in those innermost spaces that the scribes who documented temple operations chose not to record, or were prohibited from recording, and that absence tells its own kind of story. Among all the Anunnaki, Inanna's mythology is most saturated with blood symbolism, most insistent on the connection between death, transformation, and divine power. She is the goddess of love and warfare simultaneously, a combination that ancient peoples understood as coherent where modern sensibility finds it contradictory. Both domains involve the most intense physical and emotional experiences humans can have. Both involve bodies at their limits. And both involve blood, the substance that marks the body's most extreme moments, whether in birth, in battle, or in the sacrificial ceremonies that Inanna's priests conducted on her behalf. The descent of Inanna, preserved in its most complete Sumerian version on tablets from Nippur, dating to approximately 1750 BCE, describes the goddess choosing to travel to the great below, the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. The journey required passing through 7 gates, at each of which she was required to remove one element of her divine regalia: crown, lapis lazuli beads, golden ring, breastplate, measuring rod, robe, and finally the garment that covered her body entirely. At each gate, a gatekeeper enforced the rule of the underworld. Do not question the rights of the underworld. The high priest of Inanna's temple at Nippur, a man whose name survives in administrative texts as Ur-Namzi, prepared for 3 days before the annual ritual reenactment of the descent. He was required to bathe in purified water at sunrise, sunset, and midnight of the days preceding the ceremony. His meals during preparation were restricted to bread and water, the simplest possible substances. On the morning of the ceremony before dawn, he entered the inner sanctum of the Inanna temple alone, carrying a lamp of sesame oil and a bronze vessel containing water from the Euphrates mixed with specific aromatic resins. His assistants waited in the outer court, prohibited from entering until he summoned them. Once inside, Ur-Namzi conducted a sequence that temple procedure texts describe in partial detail. First, the anointing of Inanna's statue with cedar oil. Then specific incantations spoken to each of the 7 symbolic gates represented by curtained doorways within the inner sanctum. At each gate, he removed a ritual object from a dedicated table, mirroring Inanna's removal of her regalia. When he reached the innermost position, before the goddess's primary altar, he sacrificed a lamb whose blood was collected in the bronze vessel and combined with the aromatic water he had carried in. This mixture was then poured over the altar in a prescribed pattern while he recited the lament for Inanna's death in the underworld. The ceremony concluded at dawn when he emerged from the sanctum, his work completed, the cosmic drama reenacted for another year. The ritual's purpose was understood as actively sustaining the cycle that Inanna's mythology described. Her descent caused all fertility to cease while she was in the underworld, the texts say, because without the goddess of love and generation, no reproduction occurred in the world above. Her ritual death, enacted annually through ceremony, including blood offering, maintained the agricultural cycle's continuity by ensuring her resurrection was also annually enacted. The ceremony was not commemoration of a past event, but participation in an ongoing cosmic process. Dumuzi's death occupies the ceremony's shadow. In the myth, Inanna returned from the underworld required to provide a substitute to take her place in death. She chose Dumuzi, her shepherd husband, who had not mourned her absence. His death became the foundation of the shepherd king's ritual relationship to blood sacrifice in Sumerian practice. Texts describe annual mourning ceremonies for Dumuzi, the weeping for Tammuz mentioned later in biblical texts, in which blood offerings accompanied lamentation poetry. The death of the divine shepherd and the death of sacrificial animals were theologically connected, each confirming and reinforcing the other. The sensory experience of Inanna's temple during major ceremonies would have been carefully orchestrated. The inner sanctum of a major Inanna temple, such as the Iana at Uruk, maintained through multiple construction phases from approximately 3500 BCE to the 1st century BCE, measured roughly 12 meters by 6 meters in its primary configuration. Walls were plastered and sometimes decorated with painted geometric patterns. The air carried layers of scent, sesame oil from lamps, imported resins burned as incense, the metallic trace of blood from sacrificed animals, and perhaps the perfumed oils used to anoint the goddess's statue. Lapis lazuli and gold ornamented Inanna's cult statue, materials whose preciousness emphasized the goddess's cosmic significance. The same blue stone that hymns compared to blood's sacred quality decorated the divine image that received blood offerings. This visual correspondence between the offering and the ornament it honored suggests a theological sophistication in which the materials of ritual were chosen to reflect and reinforce the meaning of the ceremony. The stars above Uruk on the night of Inanna's major festivals would have included Venus in particular positions specified by astronomical observation as auspicious for the ceremony. Inanna's identification with Venus meant that her ritual calendar was directly tied to planetary observation, that the timing of blood offerings to the goddess depended on where her celestial form appeared in the night sky. Astronomy and blood ritual were not adjacent practices, but integrated elements of a single coherent system. Something about the descent narrative continues resonating across millennia in ways that simpler myths do not. It describes a divine being choosing to enter death, enduring systematic stripping of power and identity, dying in the underworld, and being restored through intervention and sacrifice. Whatever theological reality the Sumerians believed this described, the narrative captures something about the relationship between loss and transformation that generations have continued to find meaningful. Among all the blood rituals documented in Mesopotamian sources, the substitute king ceremony stands apart for what it reveals about the theological understanding of blood's relationship to divine obligation. It is also the most extensively documented ritual in which a human death, not an animal death, was a considered, calculated, administrative response to divine threat. The texts that preserve this practice are not mythological but epistolary, actual letters between kings and their court scholars, preserved in the archives of Nineveh, discussing specific cases with the practical language of experienced administrators solving a difficult problem. The ritual's logic was straightforward within its theological framework. When a severe celestial omen, particularly a lunar eclipse, threatened the king's life according to astrological interpretation, the king could be protected by temporarily vacating his royal identity and placing it on someone else. A substitute was selected, dressed in royal garments, given a throne name, and declared king. The real king retreated to a private location and assumed a false identity, sometimes referred to in texts as the farmer, while the substitute occupied the throne for a prescribed period, typically 100 days. The substitute then died. The texts are direct about this. He died, usually described as having gone to his fate or met his destiny, language that maintained ceremonial propriety while describing actual execution. His death satisfied the divine threat that the eclipse had indicated. The dangerous fate deflected from the real king onto the substitute whose royal blood, however temporarily constituted, was sufficient to discharge the obligation. The real king then resumed his identity, emerged from his protected seclusion, and was formally restored to the throne through ceremony that included specific blood offerings at the major temples. The most extensively documented case involved a substitute king during the reign of Esarhaddon of Assyria, who ruled from 681 to 669 BCE. A series of cuneiform letters between Esarhaddon and his chief court astrologer, a scholar named Marduk-Shumu-Ushur, preserved in the Nineveh archive and now in the British Museum, discuss a threatening eclipse in approximately 671 BCE. Marduk-Shumu-Ushur's letter recommends the substitute king procedure with the measured language of a professional offering expert advice. The omens are severe. The standard protective measures are insufficient. The substitute procedure is the appropriate response given the specific configuration of the threat. Esarhaddon's response confirmed the procedure. A man described in subsequent administrative texts only as Damki, a name meaning the good one, was selected as substitute. He was installed on the throne, given the royal name, and recognized in temple ritual as king for the required period. Administrative records from this period show Damki conducting royal business, receiving tribute, and being addressed with royal titles. Then the records stop. A later administrative text records offerings made for the health of Esarhaddon the king, using language that implies the real king had resumed his identity after the substitute's death. The blood shed in the substitute king's death was understood as specifically royal blood, not because the substitute was of royal lineage, but because the royal identity had been ritually transferred to him. Theology determined the blood's category, not biology. This distinction reveals something important about how Sumerian and later Mesopotamian ritual thought operated. The ritual frame transformed the substance. Blood that carried the ritual status of royalty discharged a royal obligation, regardless of whose veins it had originally run through. Imagine the substitute Damki during his 100-day reign, wearing garments that had touched a king's body, sitting on a throne that carried centuries of divine legitimacy, being addressed by royal titles that connected him to the Anunnaki's explicit authorization of human kingship. What did he understand about his situation? The letters suggest that substitutes were not deceived. They consented, perhaps recruited from prisoners or condemned men for whom the temporary elevation offered some form of dignity before death. Perhaps some genuinely believed they were serving a sacred function, that their blood would actually protect a king, whose continued life protected the cosmic order. The ceremony's final blood offering, conducted after the substitute's death, completed the ritual circuit. Temple priests sacrificed animals at Nippur's Ikur and at Asur's primary temple, the blood offerings accompanying prayers that explicitly named Esarhaddon and asked for his protection and continued divine favor. The substitute's death and the temple blood offerings together constituted a single theological transaction. The cosmic debt fully paid, the threatening fate neutralized. The king restored to his proper relationship with the Anunnaki, who had authorized his rule. What does this ritual reveal about the Sumerian and later Mesopotamian understanding of blood's theological function? It demonstrates that blood was understood as carrying specific identities and obligations that could be ritually transferred, that the divine debt created at human origins by Ila's sacrifice could be managed through careful ceremonial administration, and that the theology of blood obligation was sophisticated enough to include mechanisms for addressing extraordinary situations that exceeded ordinary sacrificial practice. The stars that had indicated the threat through eclipse configuration watched impassively as the ceremony unfolded. The same celestial mechanics that had required the ritual's activation recorded no acknowledgement of its completion. But within the theological framework that gave the ceremony meaning, the transaction was real, the debt paid, the order maintained through blood that the administration of heaven and earth required. At the height of the Ur-3 period, approximately 2100 to 2000 BCE, the temple economies of southern Mesopotamia had developed blood ritual into something approaching industrial scale. This is not metaphor. Administrative tablets from the Temple of Nana at Ur, recovered during Woolley's excavations and now distributed between the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, document the receipt and disbursement of thousands of animals annually through the temple's sacrificial system. A single administrative tablet from Ur, dated to the 44th year of Shulgi's reign, approximately 2050 BCE, records the receipt of 1,354 sheep and goats, designated specifically for ritual slaughter in a single month. Additional entries record 82 cattle, 140 doves, and 400 fish, the latter to be burned whole as ascending offerings rather than consumed. These are not annual figures, but monthly receipts for one temple in one city. Multiplied across the the dozens of major temples operating simultaneously in Ur, Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, and the other significant city-states of the period. The total scale of ritual blood sacrifice in Sumerian civilization at its peak represents a staggering mobilization of biological and economic resources. The mechanics of temple slaughter were precise and trained. Temple procedure texts from Nippur describe the ritual butcher, a specialized temple functionary whose role was distinct from both the priest who conducted the ceremony and the cook who prepared meat for distribution. The ritual butcher was required to be male, ritually clean, and trained in specific cutting sequences that the texts describe in practical detail. Primary cuts were made to the animal's throat with a copper blade whose dimensions are specified in temple equipment inventories. Approximately 25 centimeters in length, kept sharp enough to produce immediate death. The blood was not wasted. Temple drainage systems collected it, as we have seen, but texts also describe specific uses for blood as part of the offering itself. At major ceremonies, blood was applied to altar surfaces in patterns described in ritual texts as the anointing of the god's house. Blood mixed with sacred oils was used to consecrate new ritual implements before their first use. And in certain restricted ceremonies, blood was incorporated into preparations consumed by priests as part of the ceremony, a practice that appears in fragmentary texts, enough to confirm it existed, but not in sufficient detail to fully reconstruct its context or theology. Imagine approaching the outer court of Nana's temple at Ur on the morning of a full moon ceremony around 2060 BCE. The sound reaches you first, before the smell, the particular vocalizations of large numbers of animals penned together, sheep and cattle, and the occasional restless bull. Then the smell, complex and layered, animal warmth and manure, and the cedar oil burning in lamps that line the processional path. The outer court is busy with temple functionaries, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a system that has been running in this form for generations. The animals designated for sacrifice have been inspected. Temple texts specify the examination criteria: no visible injury or disease, specific age ranges for each category of offering, color requirements for certain special ceremonies. A lamb intended for Nana must be without blemish, white preferred for lunar ceremonies because of the visual correspondence to the moon's pale face. Cattle for major festivals must be mature males, their size maximizing the blood volume that constitutes the offering's substance. The distribution of sacrificed animals' meat after ceremony served as economic mechanism as well as theological completion. Temple records document careful allocation of edible portions from sacrificed animals. Priests received designated cuts by rank. Temple workers received portions according to their role, and in certain large festivals, broader distribution to the surrounding population appears in records that describe meat moving through an extensive redistribution network. The blood was the offering to the divine. The meat fed the human community that the temple served. This dual function, divine feeding and human redistribution, reveals the full sophistication of what blood ritual accomplished within Sumerian civilization. It was not extractive in the way that pure taxation would be, taking resources from the community without return. The animals were taken into the divine realm through sacrifice, but the material substance returned to the human community through redistribution, the theological transaction leaving both the divine and the human realm satisfied. The astronomical timing of major sacrificial festivals meant that the night sky was always implicated in the ceremony. Priests stationed on ziggurat platforms watched for celestial confirmation of ritual timing. The first crescent moon, the heliacal rising of specific stars, the position of planets that corresponded to the deities being honored. The sky and the altar were never disconnected in Sumerian practice. What happened below was meant to correspond with and respond to what happened above. Blood falling on altar stone as planets moved through their prescribed paths. Something was being maintained through all of this, something the Sumerians considered essential, and that 3,000 years of continuous practice suggests they took with complete seriousness. Whether that something was cosmic order as they understood it, psychological and social cohesion as we might understand it, or something else that our current categories have not yet adequately named. The architecture and the texts and the bones all confirm that it felt necessary enough to sustain the effort. What those hidden chambers and sealed deposits beneath the temples reveal about the most restricted aspects of this practice remains to be examined. Not everything that occurred in Sumerian sacred spaces made it into administrative records. Something was kept deliberately apart, practiced in restricted contexts, preserved in oral rather than written tradition. Those hidden dimensions are where we turn next. The Sumerian understanding of blood ritual was never separate from astronomical observation. These were not parallel systems that occasionally intersected, but a single integrated framework in which celestial mechanics and temple ceremony were understood as two aspects of the same cosmic reality. When blood fell on an altar, it was timed to correspond with specific configurations of the sky above. When planets moved into particular positions, specific blood offerings were triggered. The altar and the observatory were not different buildings serving different purposes. They were the same building, serving the same purpose, oriented toward the same divine order that governed both heaven and earth simultaneously. The Moldapan tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE but preserving observational knowledge, accumulated over at least 2 previous millennia, document this integration explicitly. Among the astronomical data covering star positions and planetary periods, the tablets include sections specifying which celestial events required which ritual responses. A lunar eclipse on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, the text states, required immediate blood offerings at all major temples. The sacrificial calendar suspended and replaced by emergency ceremony, whose specific content was determined by which stars were visible at the moment the eclipse began. This was not superstition, but systematic theology applied to observed celestial mechanics. The Sumerians understood that the moon's predictable cycle governed certain aspects of earthly reality, that floods came at specific stellar alignments, that agricultural seasons correlated with star positions. Extending this understanding to divine-human relationship, they concluded that the boundary between divine and human realms also fluctuated according to celestial mechanics, and that blood ritual was most effective when conducted at moments when the divine realm was most accessible. Venus cycles received particular attention in the hidden astronomical dimensions of blood ritual, the planet's 584-day cycle, moving between morning and evening appearances with periods of invisibility during superior and inferior conjunction with the sun, was understood as Inanna's actual movement between Earth, heaven, and the underworld. Her periods of invisibility corresponded to her time in the great below. Her reappearance as morning star corresponded to her resurrection. Blood offerings timed to these astronomical events were not commemorating the myth, but actively participating in the cosmic process the myth described. The Venus tablet of Amisadika documents 21 years of Venus observations correlated with earthly events, including harvests, military outcomes, and what appear to be notes about ritual efficacy. The correlations the tablet's compilers identified between Venus positions and earthly outcomes led them to specific recommendations about when particular ritual actions, including blood sacrifice, were most likely to achieve desired results. This represents astronomical knowledge serving ritual function, science embedded within theology in ways that neither modern category adequately captures. Beneath this visible astronomical framework lay something less documented and more difficult to interpret. Temple orientation at major Sumerian sites reveals deliberate astronomical alignment that served ritual purposes. The Ekur at Nippur is oriented approximately 15 degrees east of north, an alignment that some researchers identify with the rising position of specific stars significant in Sumerian celestial theology. The Eanna at Uruk shows consistent orientation across multiple rebuilding phases, suggesting the direction was considered essential rather than incidental to the building's sacred function. Modern archaeoastronomers have measured these orientations with precision instruments and compared them with reconstructed ancient sky conditions using computational models. The results are suggestive without being conclusive. Some alignments correspond with celestial events that Sumerian texts identify as ritually significant: solstice sunrise, equinox sunset, the heliacal rising of particular star groups. Others remain unexplained, orientations that might reference celestial events not yet identified in the textual record, or that might reflect practical construction considerations rather than astronomical intention. Perhaps the most hidden astronomical dimension of blood ritual was the timing of the ceremonies the texts describe as most restricted. The silent rite conducted by chief priests in inner sanctums during new moon ceremonies, the content of which texts acknowledge but do not record, may have been precisely timed to astronomical moments of seconds-level precision. If the boundary between divine and human realms was understood as depending on exact celestial configurations, then the most powerful rituals would have required exact timing, conducted at the precise moment when planetary positions reached their most significant alignment. Scholars debate whether Sumerian astronomers possessed the observational precision to identify such moments reliably. The Mul-Apen tablets demonstrate naked-eye observation of considerable accuracy, eclipse predictions within days of actual events, planetary period calculations within small percentages of modern measurements. Whether this accuracy extended to real-time observations precise enough to time ceremonies to specific minutes remains uncertain. The instruments required for such precision, if they existed, have not survived in the archaeological record. The stars that governed blood ritual timing still move through their cycles tonight, Venus tracing its 584-day pattern, the Moon following its 29.5-day cycle. The calendar the Sumerians developed from these observations underlies calendrical systems still in use. And the question of what they believed those celestial movements revealed about the divine realm's accessibility, about when blood most effectively reached its intended recipients, remains only partially answered in the tablets that survived millennia of burial and rediscovery. Beneath the visible mechanics of Sumerian blood ritual, beneath the drained altars and documented sacrifice schedules and astronomical timing systems, lay a theological understanding of what blood actually accomplished when it was shed in consecrated space. This understanding was sophisticated, internally consistent, and in certain respects more nuanced than modern categories of magical thinking or primitive superstition allow. The Sumerians had a detailed working model of how blood ritual functioned, grounded in their cosmological understanding of what blood was, what it carried, and what divine beings required from it. The Atemu concept stands at the center of this understanding. Every living being possessed an Atemu, a spirit substance that animated the body and departed at death. The Atemu was not identical with what later traditions would call a soul. It was more specific, more material in its theological status, understood as actually present within the blood rather than merely associated with it. When blood was shed, the Atemu within it was released, made available, freed from its biological container, and able to move into the divine realm where it could reach divine recipients. This understanding explains the specificity of sacrificial procedure in ways that purely symbolic interpretation does not fully account for. If blood sacrifice were merely symbolic gesture, the specific quantity of blood, the method of collection, the timing of the offering, the direction in which blood was directed, none of these details would matter significantly. Symbols communicate meaning regardless of precise implementation. But if blood was understood as carrying actual Atemu substance that needed to reach specific divine recipients, then procedure mattered enormously, the difference between correct and incorrect execution being the difference between an effective offering and wasted effort. Temple texts describe what happened to the Atemu released by sacrifice, using language that treats it as genuinely physical movement. The Atemu rises in smoke from burned offerings, flows toward divine recipients in poured libations, ascends through the vertical axis of the ziggurat toward the celestial realm where sky gods dwelled. The spatial language is consistent and deliberate. Enki, who governed the Abzu below, received offerings that went down, poured into drainage channels leading beneath the temple. Enlil, who governed the air, received offerings whose Atemu was released upward through burning. Nana, the moon god above, received blood whose collection and elevation through ceremony directed it toward the celestial realm. The divine beings who received these offerings were understood as genuinely requiring them, not in the way that a metaphorical hungry god might symbolically need feeding, but as actually sustained by the Atemu substance that blood sacrifice released. Temple texts from the Ur-the-Three period describe gods eating and drinking their offerings through language that treats divine consumption as real, rather than figurative. A hymn from Nippur describes Enlil after receiving major sacrifice as satisfied, his heart at rest, language that implies actual divine satiation, rather than merely the completion of proper ceremony. Hidden within this understanding was an uncomfortable corollary that Sumerian theology acknowledged rather than suppressed. The gods needed humans. They needed the Etemu that human-conducted blood sacrifice released and directed toward them. The divine beings who had created humanity for service were, in this framework, themselves dependent on the service they had created humanity to provide. The relationship was not purely extractive, but mutual, gods requiring human ritual labor, as genuinely as the Igigi had required human agricultural labor before their rebellion created the substitute workforce. This interpretation finds support in the flood narrative's aftermath, where gods gathered like flies around Atrahasis' post-flood sacrifice. The image is deliberately unflattering, but it accurately represents the theological understanding. Divine beings deprived of blood offerings became desperate for them, their divine sustenance interrupted by the destruction of the population that provided it. Enlil's decision to flood the world had nearly destroyed the mechanism by which the Anunnaki themselves were sustained. His later acceptance of population-limiting alternatives rather than periodic genocide reflected not merely ethical development, but practical recognition that humans couldn't be eliminated without consequence to the divine realm. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this theology, from a modern perspective, is its honesty about what it describes. Sumerian texts do not present blood ritual as benefiting primarily the humans who conduct it, as modern spiritualities tend to frame their practices. The benefit flows primarily toward the divine recipients, with humans receiving the secondary benefit of continued divine favor and cosmic order maintenance. This was understood as the terms of existence, the permanent condition established at creation, not a devotional choice, but an ontological obligation that human blood carried from the moment of Wee-Ila's sacrifice forward. The silence that followed completed blood ceremonies. That brief quietude before priests began the redistribution work was understood as the moment when divine consumption was occurring, when the released Atemu was reaching its intended recipients and the cosmic accounting was being updated. Texts describe priests waiting in stillness after major offerings before resuming activity, not merely from exhaustion, but from theological awareness that the most important part of the ceremony was happening in the moment of apparent completion. Modern neuroscience offers a different, but not entirely unrelated account of what blood ritual accomplished in the humans who conducted and witnessed it. The combination of sensory intensity, precise procedural focus, community participation, and the emotional weight of animal death reliably produces altered neurological states in which consciousness operates differently than in ordinary circumstances. Whether these states were what Sumerian priests understood as divine contact, or whether they were the neurological mechanism by which ritual theology became experientially real, remains a question that science and theology answer differently, and perhaps both answer partially. Beneath the visible floor of the Inanna Temple at Nippur, excavations conducted by Oriental Institute teams in the 1950s and 60s revealed a network of underground chambers that standard temple function does not adequately explain. The chambers are small, the largest measuring approximately 3 meters by 2 meters. Their walls of fired brick laid in bitumen mortar that preserve them against groundwater intrusion for 4 millennia. They are accessible only through narrow shafts that require a person to descend feet first, lowering themselves into darkness below the altar level of the temple above. These were not storage spaces. The chambers are too small and too difficult to access for practical storage use. They contained no evidence of food preservation, no storage jar impressions in the floors, no administrative ceilings that typically mark inventory storage in Mesopotamian contexts. What they contained instead was more difficult to categorize. Deposits of ash with fragments of burned bone, small clay vessels sealed with bitumen, and in one chamber, a deposit of what analysis identified as iron oxide mixed with organic material in proportions and configuration suggesting it had once been liquid. Iron oxide, the compound that forms when blood oxidizes and dries. The discovery was published in technical reports that treated it cautiously, noting the identification without advancing interpretive claims that the evidence could not fully support. And this caution is appropriate. Ancient organic material survives poorly in Mesopotamian conditions, and the identification of degraded blood residue requires multiple confirming analyses. But the combination of chamber design, inaccessibility, burned organic material, and iron oxide deposits describes a space used for something that required concealment, fire, and the presence of blood. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at several Mesopotamian temple sites in the 2000s and 2010s have revealed additional subsurface features that excavation has not yet accessed. At Ur, beneath the sacred precinct surrounding Nana's ziggurat, radar returns suggest chambers at depths between 3 and 5 meters below the current ground surface, in areas not previously excavated. At Uruk, beneath the Iana precinct, similar anomalies appear in radar data at multiple locations. Whether these represent undiscovered ritual chambers, collapsed storage areas, or natural geological features remains unknown until excavation can examine them directly. The temple's most restricted inner chambers, the spaces that texts describe as accessible only to highest-ranking priests, present their own category of hidden evidence. At Nippur's Ikur, the innermost room of the main temple measured approximately 4 meters by 6 meters, with a single entrance from an antechamber that provided a physical transition between the outer ritual space and the restricted interior. Woolley's description of comparable spaces at Ur notes stone slabs covering the floor's center with drainage channels beneath them, distinct from the main temple's drainage system, suggesting a separate liquid management system within the innermost restricted space. What occurred in these innermost chambers is only partially recoverable from texts that acknowledge their existence while describing their contents obliquely. References to the secret of the great gods appear in several Sumerian wisdom texts, a category of knowledge explicitly distinguished from the ritual knowledge available to ordinary priests. The secret is never directly described, only referenced as existing, as being held by specific divine beings and transmitted to specific humans under conditions of restriction that the texts do not detail. Cylinder seals from the Ur III period occasionally depict ritual scenes in inner sanctum settings that show unusual elements, priests using implements not described in standard ritual procedure texts, arrangements of vessels that don't match documented sacrificial sequences, and in several examples what appear to be human figures in postures that scholars have interpreted variously as prostration, sleep, or something else that the two-dimensional medium cannot make unambiguous. These images exist. Their interpretation remains contested. The sealed deposits found beneath altar platforms at multiple sites represent another category of hidden evidence. These foundation deposits, placed before construction and sealed beneath the floor, typically contain small clay tablets with dedicatory inscriptions, miniature vessels, and in many cases the bones of animals that appear to have been sacrificed during the building's consecration. The blood shed at a temple's founding was understood as impregnating the structure itself with sacred substance, making the building a living ritual instrument rather than merely a ceremonial space. Perhaps the most significant hidden dimension of Sumerian blood ritual is what was never written down at all. The oral component of ritual tradition, the prayers and incantations and explanatory teachings that accompanied written procedure, was substantial and was deliberately maintained in oral form by certain categories of priests. Texts from the Neo-Babylonian period reference oral traditions concerning specific ceremonies as distinct from written records, implying that some knowledge was protected from scribal documentation as a matter of deliberate policy rather than practical limitation. This policy of selective documentation means that what we possess in the cuneiform record represents the portion of Sumerian blood ritual that priests deemed appropriate for written preservation, the portion they did not write down, the most restricted, most powerful, most theologically sensitive aspects of the practice. Those may be gone entirely, dissolved into the silence that eventually swallowed the entire civilization that created them. The chambers beneath the temples hold their secrets in patient darkness, sealed against examination by groundwater and political instability, and the sheer difficulty of archaeological access in regions where modern concerns prevent the work. What they contain waits, as it has waited for 4,000 years, for conditions that will allow careful, ethical, methodical excavation to shed light on spaces designed specifically to remain in shadow. The question sits at the center of everything we have explored tonight, and honest scholarship requires acknowledging that it remains genuinely open. Were Sumerian blood rituals sophisticated psychological and social technology serving entirely human functions, or were they something more? An actual interface with forces or beings that the priests who conducted them understood as independently real? Both interpretations have serious proponents. Neither can be definitively proven or disproven with available evidence, and the choice between them reveals as much about the assumptions we bring to ancient evidence as it does about the evidence itself. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats blood ritual as extraordinarily effective social technology. Anthropologists, including Victor Turner and Clifford Geertz, developed frameworks in the mid-20th century for understanding ritual as meaning-making practice that creates and maintains the social bonds, shared identities, and psychological states that complex communities require to function cohesively. Applied to Sumerian blood ritual, this framework explains everything the texts describe without requiring any claim about supernatural reality. The rituals worked because they created shared experience, marked time in ways that gave agricultural labor cosmic significance, distributed resources through ceremonially dignified mechanisms, and provided the population with a sense of participation in the cosmic order their theology described. This interpretation is intellectually rigorous and evidentially grounded. The psychological and neurological effects of elaborate ritual are well documented in contemporary research. Studies of ceremonial practice across cultures consistently show that the combination of sensory intensity, precise procedure, community participation, and the weight of tradition produces measurable changes in brain chemistry, specifically in systems governing social bonding, stress response, and the sense of meaning and purpose. The Sumerians, conducting blood ritual in acoustically designed chambers filled with incense and lamplight and the sounds of dying animals, were almost certainly producing profound altered states in priests and participants alike. But some researchers argue this explanation, while accurate as far as it goes, does not go far enough. The texts themselves insist that divine beings required and received blood offerings, that the etemu released by sacrifice actually reached divine recipients, that ritual omissions had consequences in the divine realm that subsequently affected the earthly realm. Some scholars of religion, including those working in the phenomenological tradition following Rudolf Otto, argue that dismissing the experiential content of ritual as purely neurological reduces something genuinely complex to something merely mechanical. Perhaps the most intellectually honest position acknowledges that both accounts may be partially correct without being complete. The neurological effects of blood ritual are real. The social functions are real. And it remains possible that what ancient priests experienced in inner sanctum ceremonies, states of consciousness that the neurology of intense ritual reliably produces, included genuine perception of dimensions of reality that ordinary consciousness does not access. The debate between these positions may rest on assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself that contemporary science has not yet settled. Cross-cultural patterns complicate simple explanations in either direction. Blood ritual appears independently across civilizations that had no known contact: Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Mesoamerican, West African, Celtic, Vedic Indian. The specific implementations differ, but the underlying logic is consistent across all of them: blood as the substance that carries life force, intentional shedding as the mechanism for directing that life force toward divine recipients, proper procedure as the difference between effective and ineffective offering. We may never know whether this consistency reflects universal human intuition about the nature of blood, cultural diffusion through ancient contact networks we haven't identified, or independent discovery of something genuinely true about blood's relationship to consciousness and perhaps to dimensions of reality beyond ordinary perception. Alternative interpretations, including the ancient astronaut frameworks we have encountered in previous explorations, propose that blood ritual was an actual interface protocol, a method for interacting with non-human intelligence that required specific biological substances to function as communication medium. This interpretation reads the Sumerian texts literally. Divine beings required blood because their nature or their technology required the adamu substance blood contained, and the elaborate ritual procedures were technical specifications for effective delivery rather than ceremonial elaboration of a simpler practice. Mainstream scholarship finds this framework unnecessary and methodologically problematic, arguing that the texts make complete theological sense within ancient Near Eastern religious frameworks without invoking extraterrestrial technology. We may never know which framework more accurately describes what the Anunnaki were, if they were anything beyond theological constructs, but the alternative interpretation, presented fairly rather than dismissively, asks questions that the mainstream framework sometimes fails to fully address. Why the operational specificity? Why the consistent cross-cultural patterns? Why did practitioners across 3,000 years maintain that these practices produced actual results, not merely feelings of meaning? The mystery has value precisely because it cannot be closed. If we knew definitively that Sumerian blood ritual was purely social technology, we would lose something. Some reminder that the most fundamental human questions about what we are, why we exist, and what forces govern our reality remain genuinely open. And if we knew definitively that the rituals were actual divine interface, we would lose something different: the humility of not knowing, the spaciousness that uncertainty creates. The open question invites us to remain curious rather than certain, to hold ancient evidence with wonder rather than categorization. The theological concept at the heart of Sumerian blood ritual was not devotion in the sense that modern religious practice typically understands it. It was not worship freely offered by grateful beings toward beloved creators. It was something older and more structural than either of those framings, closer to what the texts actually describe: an obligation created at the moment of human origin that required ongoing service, permanent attention, and regular blood offering to maintain the terms of existence established when Ila's divine blood mixed with clay to create the first humans. The Sumerian term that scholars translate as corvée labor or divine service. The word arad, referring to the servant-slave relationship of humans to the Anunnaki, captures something of this obligation's character. But even arad doesn't fully convey the permanence the theology intended. Human service to the gods was not a social arrangement that could theoretically be renegotiated. It was built into human nature at the biological level, encoded in the divine blood that animated us, and that we carried in our bodies as both gift and obligation. Every human who breathed carried the atemu of Ila's blood. Every human therefore participated, by virtue of simply existing, in the original divine transaction that had created them. This understanding structured all of Mesopotamian civilization in ways that extended far beyond formal temple practice. Agricultural labor was understood as service to the divine beings who owned the land. Trade was conducted under divine authorization, merchants calling on Enki as patron of commercial transaction. Warfare was fought under divine mandate, kings seeking Enlil's sanction before campaigns. Even ordinary domestic life, birth and marriage and death, was framed within ritual contexts that acknowledged divine oversight and required appropriate ceremonial observance. The moment when this system began failing is visible in the historical record, and it is sobering to witness. The late Bronze Age collapse, roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, saw the simultaneous breakdown of virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The Hittite Empire collapsed entirely. Mycenaean Greece's palace cultures ended. Egyptian power contracted dramatically. The Ugaritic city-state was destroyed and abandoned. Across the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, systems that had functioned for centuries broke down within a generation. In Mesopotamia, texts from this period describe the gods withdrawing, abandoning their cities, refusing to accept offerings that had previously maintained divine favor. Lamentation texts written in the aftermath of destroyed cities use language that would have been immediately familiar to anyone who knew the lamentation over the destruction of Ur from a century earlier. Divine abandonment as the mechanism of catastrophe, the gods withdrawing their protection and allowing destruction to proceed because the terms of the blood covenant had somehow been violated or could no longer be maintained. Whether this divine abandonment was understood as cause or theological explanation of events whose actual causes were climatological, epidemiological, and military remains debated. Some scholars argue the Lamentations preserve genuine theological crisis, moments when practitioners of blood ritual experienced actual failure of efficacy, when the system stopped producing results that had previously sustained divine favor. Others interpret the abandonment language as retrospective theological framing of historical events that had mundane causes. Perhaps both accounts are partially correct. The blood debt's influence did not end with Sumerian civilization. Later traditions that inherited Mesopotamian theology preserved versions of the original obligation in transformed frameworks. The biblical concept of blood atonement, the idea that sin requires blood sacrifice to restore proper relationship between human and divine, carries structural similarities to the Sumerian blood debt that scholars of comparative religion note without being able to definitively establish as genetic inheritance versus parallel theological development. The Hebrew word kepher, typically translated as atonement, shares its root meaning with concepts of covering or wiping away, similar to the Sumerian understanding of blood offering as discharging accumulated divine obligation. Greek tradition preserved the concept of theoxenia, divine guest friendship that required specific offerings to maintain, a relationship between mortals and immortals structured by obligation and requiring regular ceremonial servicing. The Vedic yajna ritual, central to early Hindu practice, describes fire sacrifice as maintaining the cosmos, feeding divine beings through smoke, and offering in ways that parallel Sumerian theology and structure, if not specific detail. These cross-cultural resonances suggest that whatever the Sumerians understood about blood's relationship to divine obligation, they were touching something that multiple independent civilizations recognized as significant. We may never know whether the blood debt the Sumerians described was real in a cosmic sense, whether divine beings who created humanity from sacrificed blood actually required ongoing blood service to maintain the terms of creation. We may never know whether the 3,000 years of blood ritual that Mesopotamian civilization maintained produced actual effects in dimensions of reality beyond the neurological and social. These are genuinely open questions, not rhetorical gestures toward mystery. What we do know is that the people who conducted these rituals believed they mattered in ways that were not merely psychological. They pressed that belief into clay tablets, built it into architectural infrastructure, encoded it in astronomical observation, and maintained it through political upheaval, dynastic change, military conquest, and gradual cultural transformation across 3 millennia. That sustained conviction, held by sophisticated civilizations whose achievements in mathematics and astronomy and literature we still admire, deserves to be taken seriously even when we cannot verify what they claimed to experience. Perhaps the blood debt was real in a way we have not yet developed adequate frameworks to evaluate. Perhaps it was a magnificently functional belief system that held civilization together through mechanisms we are only beginning to understand through cognitive science and neurological research. Perhaps it was both simultaneously real and constructed, theologically true and psychologically functional, ancient wisdom and ancient institution woven together in ways that resist our categories. The mystery that remains is not a failure of evidence, but an invitation to humility before the full complexity of what ancient peoples believed, experienced, and created. Their rituals shaped civilization for 3,000 years. The questions they raised about blood, obligation, divine presence, and human origins remain unanswered. And that enduring openness, that refusal of the evidence to collapse into simple explanation, is itself worth honoring. The last temple blood ritual conducted in the Sumerian tradition occurred sometime in the first centuries of the Common Era, in one of the few remaining temples where ancient practice had survived the successive waves of Persian, Greek, and Parthian conquest that transformed Mesopotamia across the preceding millennium. The exact date is unknown. No text records the final ceremony. No inscription marks the last priest who approached the last altar. The tradition simply ended the way most traditions end, not with dramatic conclusion, but with gradual attenuation. Fewer priests trained, fewer resources allocated, fewer people who remembered why the ceremonies mattered, until the day came when no one conducted the rite and no one noticed enough to record the absence. The silence that followed lasted nearly 2,000 years. What survived that silence did so through transformation rather than preservation. The most direct inheritance passed into Babylonian and Assyrian practice, which maintained Sumerian blood ritual structures with adaptation across the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. When Babylon absorbed Sumerian theological tradition, it preserved the essential framework: blood as carrier of divine substance, regular sacrifice as maintenance of cosmic order, the king as ritual intermediary between human and divine realms. The specific Sumerian deities were renamed or merged with Babylonian equivalents, but the underlying theology of blood obligation persisted with remarkable structural fidelity. Biblical traditions preserved fragments in ways that scholars have been documenting with increasing precision since the 19th century. The Hebrew concept of dam, blood as life substance belonging ultimately to God rather than to any individual creature, reflects the same theological logic as the Sumerian etemu carried in blood. Levitical blood ritual, the elaborate sacrificial system described in the Hebrew Bible, shows structural parallels to Mesopotamian temple practice that are too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, including the requirement for unblemished animals, the specific direction of blood application to altar surfaces, and the understanding that blood offering maintained the covenant relationship between divine and human realms. The New Testament's central theological claim that one sacrificial death established a permanent blood covenant between humanity and the divine carries Mesopotamian structural logic into a radically transformed theological context, whether this represents conscious inheritance, unconscious cultural transmission through the extensive Babylonian influence on Israelite theology during the exile period, or independent theological discovery of the same underlying logic. The pattern connecting Wi Ila's sacrifice to later atonement theology is visible to any careful comparative reader. Greek religion preserved blood ritual through the Thusia, the sacrificial system that structured Greek religious practice from Homeric times through the classical period. The procedures described by ancient Greek authors for proper sacrifice, the selection of unblemished animals, the collection of blood at the altar base, the ascending smoke carrying divine sustenance toward the gods, parallel Sumerian practice closely enough that some historians of religion propose cultural transmission through the Bronze Age trade networks that connected Mesopotamia and the Aegean. Others argue parallel development driven by similar theological logic. Either way, the pattern persisted in recognizable form. The rediscovery of Sumerian blood rituals' actual documentation began with the 19th century decipherment of cuneiform, which we have discussed in earlier sections. But the specific study of Mesopotamian blood ritual as a coherent theological and social system developed primarily in the 20th century as the accumulation of translated texts reached sufficient critical mass for synthetic analysis. Scholars including Thorkild Jacobsen, whose 1976 work, The Treasures of Darkness, remains foundational, and more recently, Francesca Rochberg, whose 2004 study of Babylonian astronomy and ritual revealed the depth of celestial ceremonial integration, have gradually reconstructed the framework with increasing completeness. Even now, in the 21st century, discoveries continue reshaping understanding. In 2015, a team of researchers from the University of Tübingen published analysis of previously untranslated tablets from the Nippur collection, identifying a category of ritual texts they called blood application procedures. Detailed instructions for the ceremonial use of blood in altar consecration that had been present in museum collections for over a century but never fully recognized for what they described. The tablets had been cataloged, stored appropriately, and simply waited for a scholar with the right background to understand what they contained. Still today, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad works to catalog, conserve, and study collections disrupted by decades of political instability and the devastating 2003 looting that removed thousands of artifacts from secure storage. International scholarly partnerships support this work, recognizing that what remains unstudied in Mesopotamian collections may include ritual texts that would significantly deepen understanding of blood ceremony practice. The work continues, patient and methodical in the same spirit that the tablets themselves embody. The stars that governed Sumerian blood ritual timing still wheel through their cycles tonight, Venus tracing the same 584-day pattern that Inanna's priests watched with such careful attention, the moon following its 29.5-day cycle across the same sky that new moon ceremonies were timed to honor. The celestial mechanics that the Sumerians understood as divine presence expressing itself in observable movement continue operating with the same precision that allowed their astronomers to predict eclipses and their priests to time ceremonies to specific planetary configurations. What the legacy of Sumerian blood ritual means for us now is not a simple question with a comfortable answer. It means we are further from our origins than we realize, descended from civilizations whose understanding of blood, obligation, and divine presence was more elaborate and more earnest than our secular frameworks easily accommodate. It means the religious traditions that shaped Western civilization have roots in temple altars we have mostly forgotten, in blood theology that persisted through transformation across 3 millennia before reaching the forms we recognize. And it means the questions the Sumerians were asking about what we owe for our existence, about what divine beings might require from us, about what blood carries and what its shedding accomplishes. Those questions were never fully answered and were never fully abandoned. Even now, in ways we may not recognize, those questions live in the theological frameworks we inherited, in the religious rituals that preserve ancient patterns in modern dress, in the persistent human intuition that blood is not merely biological fluid, but something that carries meaning beyond the merely physical. The story did not end when the last Sumerian priest approached the last altar. It transformed, migrated, took new forms in new theological contexts, and eventually found its way to this moment, to you listening in the dark, carrying in your own veins the substance that ancient priests understood as the most sacred material in the cosmos. The legacy continues in you, in the simple biological fact that you are alive, that blood moves through you as it moved through every human who ever stood before an altar, who ever offered what they had towards something they could not fully see, or name, or prove, but could not stop reaching toward. Whatever the Anunnaki were, whatever they required, whatever the rituals accomplished, They addressed something permanent in what it means to be human. The awareness that we exist because something was given, and the persistent feeling, however we might frame it in our own time, that something is still owed. That feeling, ancient and patient and quietly present, has always been part of what we are. The altars are cold now, have been cold for 2,000 years, their drainage channels dry, their altar surfaces bare of the offerings that once fell on them with such careful regularity. The temples themselves have mostly returned to the earth they were built from, mud brick dissolving back into the alluvial plain that the Tigris and Euphrates deposited over millions of years of patient geological work, where priests once moved through lamplit corridors reciting incantations memorized across years of temple training. There is now only wind moving across elevated ground, the tells that mark where cities stood, carrying dust that was once brick, that was once ceremony, that was once the most elaborate attempt at divine communication our species had yet devised. Wherever you are right now, let that image settle. The wind over the ruins, the ground that holds so much. You are breathing, quietly, in a world that those priests could not have imagined. The technology around you, the darkness of your room, the device carrying these words to you, all of it would have been incomprehensible to the scribe who pressed Waila's sacrifice into clay with steady hands and complete conviction that what he was recording mattered, that future generations would need to know what he knew. He was right about that, even if he could not have anticipated what form those future generations would take, or how different the world would be in which they finally received his testimony. The stars he watched are still there. This is one of the few things we can say with complete confidence across the entire distance between his world and yours. Venus is tracing its 584-day cycle through the same geometric relationship with the Sun and Earth that Inanna's priests tracked across centuries of careful observation. The Moon is somewhere in its 29.5-day progression, waxing or waning or dark, the same patient rhythm that governed the sacrificial calendar of every major Sumerian temple from Eridu to Nippur to Ur. The celestial mechanics that ancient astronomers understood as divine presence expressing itself in observable movement are still operating, indifferent to whether any priest is watching, whether any ceremony is timed to their configurations, whether any altar waits to receive what their positions once required. The stone remembers in the way stone remembers, through persistence rather than consciousness. Beneath the tells of Nippur and Uruk and Eridu, limestone altar platforms still exist at depths archaeologists have measured but not always fully excavated. Their drainage channels, cut by craftsmen who understood exactly what those channels needed to manage, remain angled at the precise degrees that direct liquid toward collection points. No liquid has moved through them in 2 millennia. But the angle is still correct. The geometry of intention survives even when the intention is forgotten. Some mysteries will remain exactly as we found them tonight. We do not know the full content of the silent rites conducted in inner sanctums. We do not know with certainty what priests experienced in those restricted ceremonies, whether the altered states that ritual reliably produces connected them to something real beyond themselves or only to something real within themselves, or whether that distinction is even as meaningful as we assume. We do not know whether the blood debt the Sumerians described was a cosmic reality or a theological framework, or whether those two things are as different as they sound. These questions were alive 4,000 years ago. They are alive tonight. They will likely still be alive when whatever comes after us looks back at our own attempts to understand. There is something restful in that. The mystery is not a problem awaiting solution, but a permanent feature of the landscape, as much a part of what it means to be human as the blood that moves through you now, carrying its ancient cargo of itemu or life force or biochemistry, whatever name fits best in your own framework, still warm, still circulating, still marking the boundary between alive and not alive in the most immediate and intimate way possible. You are alive tonight. The altars are cold, the stars are watching, and somewhere beneath the wind-crossed plain of southern Iraq, Stone surfaces remember the shape of what was placed upon them, patient and still and enduring, holding the outline of ceremonies that addressed questions we are still asking.